George Washington was the first president to take the oath of office with his hand placed on a Bible, starting a long tradition which has been carried out by most presidents. John Adams was the first president without any military experience. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to shake hands with White House guests. During the two previous administrations, guests would bow to the president. Jefferson hated such formalities and things that distanced the president from the common man. James Madison was the nation's first wartime president as he presided over the War of 1812. James Monroe was the first president to have a foreign capital named in his honor. The African country, Liberia's capital city, is named Monrovia. Monroe had supported the city during its early development, as he wanted it to be a home for freed slaves. John Quincy Adams was probably the first president to take his oath of office with his hand on a book other than the Bible. For the first 10 presidents, it actually isn't known exactly what book was used for each oath-taking. However, by Adams' own account, he didn't use the Bible, but rather a law book. Andrew Jackson was the first president born into poverty. Perhaps in contrast with the idealistic rags-to-riches story for American presidents, it took the country 40 years to elect a president who didn't come from some degree of wealth. Martin Van Buren was the first of 5 presidents born in New York. William Henry Harrison was the first president to be born in the same state as his vice president. Both Harrison and Vice President John Tyler were born in Virginia. In fact, both were even born in the same county. Presidents and vice presidents aren't supposed to be from the same state, but this wasn't an issue for the Harrison-Tyler ticket, as despite being born in Virginia, Harrison held political office in Ohio, and it effectively became his home state. John Tyler was the first president to face a vote of impeachment, though it was unsuccessful. With a strong independent streak and unwillingness to bend to party or political pressures, Tyler made many enemies throughout his presidency. James K. Polk was the first president to have the presidential anthem, "Hail to the Chief," used regularly for his appearances. The anthem had been used on occasion for presidents as early as Washington, but Polk's wife requested it be used more often to give her husband more prestige. As one historian put it, quote, Polk was not an impressive figure, so some announcement was necessary to avoid the embarrassment of his entering a crowded room unnoticed. At large affairs, the band rolled the drums as they played the march, and a way was cleared for the president. Zachary Taylor was the first president to have served in the Mexican-American War. The others were 14th President Franklin Pierce and 18th Ulysses S. Grant. Millard Fillmore was the first president to establish a permanent library in the White House. Through constant reading at a young age, Fillmore acquired knowledge to work his way out of poverty. He retained his love of reading and books all throughout his life. Franklin Pierce was the first president to have central heating installed in the White House. James Buchanan was the first president to meet with a member of the royal family in the White House. In the final months of his term, Buchanan learned that the Prince of Wales was visiting Canada, hence he initiated a meeting with the prince as a symbolic gesture of friendship between the United States and Great Britain. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to have his portrait featured on United States coinage. In 1909, Lincoln was put on the penny in honor of the centennial of his birth. Americans had long been weary of having portraits of presidents featured on currency, but the reverence for Lincoln outweighed traditional sentiment. Andrew Johnson was the first president to give a speaking tour while serving as president. In his day, it was considered undignified for a presidential candidate to campaign for themselves, and the idea of a sitting president touring the country giving speeches was unheard of. Johnson had always been adept at public speaking and debate, especially those of the crass manner, and he wasn't one to be ruled by convention. During his speech, he argued with hecklers, bragged about his accomplishments in life, and even had to be stopped from getting into physical altercations. Ulysses S. Grant was the first of 7 presidents born in Ohio. Of the 9 next men elected president after Grant, 6 were the other Ohio-born presidents. Like Grant, 4 of them were also Civil War veterans. Rutherford B. Hayes was the first sitting president to visit California. California was admitted to the Union in 1850. Hayes visited in 1880, 30 years later. James A. Garfield was the first president who was also a mathematician. Garfield was one of the nation's most intelligent presidents. He'd also written a proof of the Pythagorean theorem and had been president of a university. Chester Arthur was the first president to take the oath of office in his hometown. He took the oath following Garfield's death. Though Garfield had been ill and lying in bed for 2 months after being shot, Arthur hadn't traveled to Washington, D.C., as he thought doing so would appear presumptuous. Grover Cleveland was the first president to veto over 100 bills, and by the end of his 2 terms, he actually vetoed 500. Committed to extreme fiscal conservatism and to fighting corruption, Cleveland vetoed anything he believed would make Americans reliant on the government, or any bill he thought was being used for self-interest of politicians or special interest. Benjamin Harrison was the first president to have electric lighting installed in the White House. However, he was so afraid of being electrocuted that he never used any light switches. William McKinley was the first president to visit the gravesite of famed abolitionist John Brown. Brown's gravesite was a stop on a train ride McKinley was aboard, and McKinley attended a ceremony in Brown's honor. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president who ascended to the presidency upon the death of his predecessor and was later elected to a full term in his own right. Prior to Roosevelt, 4 vice presidents had ascended to the presidency after the sitting president's death, but all failed to get elected to their own term. In these cases, they probably weren't the types who would have ever seriously run for the presidency in the first place. In contrast, Roosevelt was extremely ambitious, energetic, and driven, and proved to be a strong enough politician and president to easily win his own election. William Howard Taft was the first president to throw a ceremonial first pitch at a baseball game. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to have alliteration in his name. He was later followed by Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and Ronald Reagan. Warren G. Harding was the first president to be born after the Civil War. Harding was born in November 1865, 7 months after the war ended. Calvin Coolidge was the first president to be born on the 4th of July. Herbert Hoover was the first president to have a post-presidency of over 30 years long. In total, Hoover lived 31 years after his presidency ended and outlived 2 of his successors, Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. As of this recording, he holds the record for the second longest post-presidency. Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to appear on a presidential ticket 5 different times. 4 of these were as the Democratic candidate for president in the 4 elections he won. However, 12 years before his first victory, he appeared on the 1920 Democratic ticket alongside James M. Cox, who was running against Warren Harding. Harry Truman was the first president to leave office on January 20th. Previous presidents left office on March 4th, as that was the day the new president was inaugurated. The date for Inauguration Day changed under Franklin Roosevelt. However, Roosevelt died in office, meaning Truman was the first to leave office with the new rule in place. Dwight Eisenhower was the first president, while in office, to visit the following foreign nations: Afghanistan, Chile, Greece, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Portugal, South Korea, Spain, Switzerland, Taiwan, and Turkey. John F. Kennedy was the first president to be survived by both of his parents. He was only 46 when he was assassinated in 1963. His father died 6 years later in 1969 at 81, and his mother died 32 years later in 1995. He was also outlived by his paternal grandmother, who died 9 months after his assassination. Lyndon B. Johnson was the first president from the Deep South. He came from Texas. Technically, Dwight Eisenhower was also born in Texas. However, his family moved to Kansas when he was only 2, and Eisenhower always considered Kansas to be his home state. Johnson grew up in Texas and rose to prominence there. Other Southerners had become president, but none from the Deep South. Most had been from Virginia or Tennessee. Richard Nixon was the first president to have a meeting with a Japanese emperor when he met with Emperor Hirohito in 1971. Gerald Ford was the first president who had previously served as House Minority Leader. He served in this role from 1965 to 1973 and was still serving in the role when he was selected by Richard Nixon as vice president. Jimmy Carter was the first president to meet with a pope at the White House when in 1979 he met with Pope John Paul II. Previously, both Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce met Pope Pius IX, but both had done so after their presidencies. Woodrow Wilson met with Pope Benedict XV while serving as president, but the meeting wasn't in the White House. Ronald Reagan was the first president to have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Long before he became president, he had a long career in acting that spanned nearly 30 years. He was granted his star in 1960. George Bush was the first president to have a marriage lasting 73 years. He married Barbara Pierce in 1945, when he was 20 and she was 19. They were together all the way until Barbara's death in 2018. Bill Clinton was the first president born after World War II. He was born on August 19, 1946, just days shy of a year after the war's end. George W. Bush was the first president born in Connecticut. Technically, this makes him one of the 8 presidents from a New England state. However, the family moved to Texas when Bush was so young that he considers it to be his home state rather than Connecticut. Barack Obama was the first president born in Hawaii, which also makes him the first president born in a non-contiguous state, meaning a state that is not connected to the mainland or bordering another state. Donald Trump was the first president to cross North Korea's demarcation line and enter the country while in office. There has always been tension between the United States and North Korea as they fought on opposite sides of the Korean War, and there have never been formal relations between the two countries. The larger effect of Trump's visit and whether it might improve relations is yet to be seen. Joe Biden is the first president to have a female vice president, with Kamala Harris. Previous presidential candidates had female running mates. In 1984, Walter Mondale ran with Geraldine Ferraro, and in 2008, John McCain ran with Sarah Palin. However, Biden was the first to run with a woman and get elected. If you'd like to see more videos like this on United States presidents, you can subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to show your support for the channel and have your name featured in the credits, you can make a Patreon donation of either $2, $5, or $15 a month. Patreon link in the description below.